Sometimes there are games that seem confused about what they are or even what they want to be, resulting in what is often essentially just genre salad that we hope tastes good. Liberté falls into this category as it is entirely a case of throwing roguelites, deck builders, and a splash of action RPGs into a big mixing bowl and hoping for the best. And thankfully, it does do a handful of things well, though at the same time, it does struggle in some other areas that could have been resolved by limiting this mix just a bit. So today we're going to look at the good, the bad, and the broken when it comes to this interesting attempt at a genre mashup. Starting with the good, the story in all of this is pretty straightforward. You are the chosen individual, or more precisely, the chosen clump of life matter, that has been given the task to help decide who the future ruler is, since the Lovecraftian entity that created you disrupted the change of power to create a vacuum that now needs to be filled. This would be fine, hell, it could even be kind of cool and compelling, but it does have some quirks about it due to being latched into a roguelite game. And that's namely that you're basically unlocking it in small batches as you make your way through the game, rather than having a solid, overarching, continuous narrative that you can simply just follow along with. This often leaves me unsatisfied session to session with the lore, since you'll often unlock a very limited amount of actual lore with each playthrough, basically amounting to the arguments between factions that you choose a side on, and the occasional progression of the core story if you get far enough into a run. The stutter step progression from the roguelite aspect carries over into the gameplay as well, since to advance your options, you'll play through the game as you expect from a roguelite, but usually it's just going to be small increases in the options to your deck, rather than actually advancing the playstyle outside of sometimes unlocking character skins that can change your base attack options. There's 4 of these. So basically a character select that unlocks slowly, and an equally slow progress to unlock any real deep customization of your player deck, because as mentioned earlier, this is a deck builder too. The way this works into the gameplay is that you build a deck out of your unlocked cards, with limitations of 2 copies of a card per deck, and up to 40 cards total. And as usual, build a small deck and you'll get the cards you want sooner. Build a large deck and you're at the whims of RNGesus. These cards basically serve as both your active skills and passive talents, requiring you to burn similar cost cards to play them for their effect through a mana system. Now, as far as the mechanics of how a card system works into an action RPG, in this case, when you play these cards, it makes them part of your skill set, much like spending a skill point would in another game. And then you're free to use them until you play a card that replaces that slot, with the only exception being consumable cards, which do have a limited number of uses, so you will run out of them. And of course, passive skills are just permanent buffs for the length of that run as well, though I wish it was more clear which ones would stack and which ones would not. Now, the skills do take a slightly different approach than other action RPGs. Firstly, you're restricted to only using 1 close range, 1 long range, and 1 utility skill in terms of reusable skills, and you of course can only have 1 ultimate and 1 consumable active at a time in terms of limited use skills. And by playing a card for any other skill, it will simply replace the old one on your bar, and that's that. You generally won't see this much with the ultimates since they are nabbed from special challenge events rather than from your deck. The other, more major way it differs is that it uses an attack-based cooldown rather than a time-based cooldown on the reusable skills, meaning you need to do a certain number of attacks between specials to cause them to refresh. This means active fighting is the only way to get these abilities back into the cycle, so the common strategies of kiting enemies while you recharge simply will not work here. While this does slightly favor the ranged skin a little bit due to the mobility and style of combat, this advantage is minuscule at best and balanced by the fact that she cannot backstab, which is a pretty decent damage bonus. This also does the nice thing of making the combat feel more dynamic by making it mandatory to keep fighting rather than running away. Now, the values on the skills I've tried over the course of testing this game all seem to flow fairly well with this system, and they never felt like they had extreme or hard to achieve cooldown values, so juggling them was fairly reasonable with the normal attacks and dodges. And yes, dodging is absolutely important in this game, since it's not very easy to become a face-tanking badass with the cards it gives you, just at least the ones you get access to. And your consumable healing items are extremely limited in their uses, and will set you back as much as a proper passive skill to actually cast. Now, you can get more cards from the environment with shops and item drops, but these are fairly basic types of effects, such as stat boosts and consumables, so you will still get more cards, just not the deck-specific ones that you may have been building around. And weirdly, this deck building philosophy almost feels counterintuitive to other roguelites, since instead of each run adding variety and snowball potential as you unlock more stuff, it mostly just unlocks new cards to consciously add to the deck. So the runs will feel very samey, especially with the limited scenarios available on each run. This is further compounded by the fact that you won't be unlocking a lot of cards with each run, so you'll only see minor changes each time you go through. This samey feeling sadly also carries over to most of the combat, which is sadly the most important part of action RPGs. This is mostly because it often feels like you're doing the same battle against trash over and over on each run, with only the bosses and some special scenes really giving you much in the way of creative encounters, and you'll generally have seen most of those after a handful of runs. Most roguelites, like Binding of Isaac, combat this by keeping your runs varied with items, so different tools for similar problems to make your work around basically what you found, while action RPGs like Grim Dawn and Last Epoch do it by making all the same feeling areas into large continuous maps, so when you're done with them, you'll have fought through one continuous battle through similar enemies, rather than a half dozen battles through similar enemies in similar looking areas, with all the loading screens in between. How Liberté could solve this weird repetition feeling would unfortunately require reworking at least one of the major pillars of the game, which results in an unsolvable problem unless concessions are made, which is a problem in and of itself since it would drastically change the game's scope and functionality, by either greatly expanding the level design requirements with the action RPG example, or by rebuilding a large chunk of the progression system with the roguelite example, neither of which is really viable this close to release without some seriously gnarly crunch. It is a shame overall that this game falls into the "I like this, but it's ruined by that" kind of struggle for me. And while it has gotten a bit better over the course of early access, it comes down to a core design issue with the components essentially fighting each other, resulting in a good enough game outside of a handful of bugs, but definitely not something that is going to rank as Game of the Year or even just a cult classic, and pretty much weirdly see it going down the same path as Darksburg, where it has some fun bits and it will be fun with friends, but when that dries up, I doubt I'll hear about it again, except for maybe a couple friends I know who like to do 100% collections in games like this. Now, normally I don't like leaving games with a low or middling note without at least giving a suggestion or design decision on how to bring the game up to a point where I could recommend it. But in the case of Liberté, it sits in that strange point where I don't hate the components, but I recognize that one of them essentially needs to go away to let the others grow into their full scope, since it just feels like a lot of 6 out of 10s fighting each other and dragging it down to a 4 or 5 out of 10. For example, if they dropped the roguelite aspect and just had you adjusting your deck between story beats as you unlock new things with the factions as you proceed through, you'd have a good deck builder action RPG that could have the story develop in a more enjoyable, logical, and continuous step, and encourage replayability by letting you choose different paths in a more meaningful fashion. If they instead did the opposite and leaned into the roguelite aspect more and let you find random new cards as you level up during your run, in addition to the cards you pull from your constructed deck that could lead it up to possibly snowballing or having fun combos and let you hunt down cool combos based on luck, it would basically make it more into a roguelite action RPG that is like Binding of Isaac and the such. But as it stands, as I've probably repeated a few times and driven it into the ground, each of the components as they are implemented now chop the others off at the knee. And what is actually a really cool concept suffers a lot from it. So I can only really recommend it if you're looking for a game to burn a long stretch of time into basically small story progressions and unlocks. And this basically results in us still lacking much competition whenever it comes to eldritch horror action RPGs. A niche that really has a lot of potential, but is frequently squandered. So what would you do to fix this game? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the patrons and channel members that make this content possible.